What is up guys, Top Tier Yu-Gi-Oh here, and today I've got a pure Tri-Brigade deck profile, just an update for the current metagame, and to be honest, this is a rough format for Tri-Brigade, but that is exactly why for this list, I wanted to focus in on the theory and the statistics, because when you're playing a rogue deck, your deck building has to be perfect. I'm going to show you guys exactly how I built this deck and what went into building it, so let's go ahead and get into it. Starting with the main deck monsters, we've got 3 copies of Rescue Cat, 3 copies of Fractal, 1 Foolish Burial, and then 1 Tinky. These are the main starter cards in the deck. Having any one of these in your opening hand almost guarantees it's going to be a good hand, and so that's why we max out on the cards that will start our plays. On top of that, we have 3 copies of Kit, 3 copies of Nerval, 3 copies of Karis, and then 1 copy of 1-for-1, which is essentially a 4th Karis. It's like literally the exact same card. You're discarding a monster that isn't specifically a beast, or a winged beast in this case, and then you're summoning a Tri-Brigade monster, in this case, in 1-for-1's case, a Nerval, that can use the on-field effect. So it's very similar to Karis and functions as a 4th copy of it. And then finally we play 2 copies of Tri-Brigade Revolt. And now I think the main thing that really sticks out in this lineup is the 3rd copy of Karis and then the 1-for-1, and I think it's really necessary in this format due to the number of hand traps being played. And so after looking at all of the decks in this most recent YCS and looking at like all of the top 32 decks, one thing I realized, well first I made a spreadsheet for it, but through looking at that spreadsheet, of those top 32 decks, they averaged close to 11 hand traps and an average of a 44 card deck, meaning that there was approximately a 78% chance for your opponent to, or for one of these decks to draw into a hand trap, and a 37% chance of them to see more than one. And so because of that, it was imperative that this deck is able to play through hand traps, and Karis is one of the main ways that we can do it within our engine. And so I felt that it was very important to max out on Karis and 1-for-1. And then Revolt does also let you play through hand traps too, and of course you can do your combos in certain ways to play around them. I made a whole combo guide for it, but it does help a lot more to have specific cards like the extra copy of Karis and the 1-for-1 to play through hand traps, because I've seen a lot of other pure Tri-Brigade lists only playing 2 copies of Karis, and with every deck playing, you know, on average 10 plus hand traps, 2 Karis is simply not enough. And now later in this video, I am going to have a little stat summary where I talk about all of the key statistics that went into this deck building process, and keep this previous one in mind that again, at the last YCS, the top 32 decks played an average of 10 plus hand traps in an average 44 card deck, giving them approximately a 78% chance of seeing a hand trap, and then a 37% chance of seeing more than one. Keep that stat in mind, it's very important, because we are going to get back to that a little bit later. Moving into our own hand traps, we play 3 copies of Nibiru, 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence, 2 copies of Effect Veiler, 2 copies of Ghost Bell, 2 copies of Ghost Ogre, 1 Ash Blossom, and then 1 DD Crow. And so this gives us a total of 14 hand traps. And again, this is very statistically significant, because given the way the format has evolved, you truly need more than 1 hand trap in every single hand in which you're going second, due to the prominence of the Brave token engine as well as combo decks in general, because a lot of these decks are making that adventure Griffin Rider very early within their combos before they're even getting into their main plays. And so whatever your first hand trap is, it's just trading with the Griffin. Then you need that second hand trap to actually stop them. Same against a lot of combo decks. They're making Baron, Herald, or some other negation very early within their play before even getting to their Needle Fiber or their Auroradon. And so you really need to have multiple hand traps. And by playing 14 of them, well, really you can change the numbers up a little bit. You could get away with 13, but I wanted to ensure that there was a greater than 50% chance of drawing more than 1 hand trap, so that in more games than not, this deck will have multiple hand traps. And again, due to the way the format is, I think that's a key statistical threshold to reach. The way their numbers work out is you have to be playing at least 13 hand traps in a 40 card or 41 card deck, 14 hand traps in a 42 or 43 card deck. And then obviously you could be playing more hand traps in a smaller deck. So if you're playing 14 in a 40 card deck or 15 in a 40 card deck, it just increases the odds even higher. And so given the number of hand traps we want to play, as for why I chose these specific ones, I felt that Nibiru was the most impactful hand trap right now, again due to the prevalence of combo decks. But with that Nibiru, because you do need multiple hand traps, I wanted to play the ones that combo the best with it. And so obviously you want Nib plus some sort of effect negation so that you can negate that Griffin or negate that Baron or negate that Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon if you're playing Virtual Worlds, or whatever it may be. You want to be able to negate their negation. And so Nib plus Veiler, Nib plus Imperm is very key. But why I went with 3 Imperm is that Imperm can be that 6th card when going up against an established board, but also it doesn't have to be sent to graveyard, so it plays around Herald a little bit. It also is not once per turn, so if you have multiples, it's the only hand trap that we play that is not once per turn. Or Veiler's not once per turn either, but Veiler has other issues that we'll get to. But I felt that Imperm was definitely worth playing 3 copies of. It also does not play into Called By or Triple Tack. It's just a very solid card in its own right. I think Ogre is also a really good choice because it can be a 6th card. It's powerful this format because it removes the monster from the board, which is very relevant in a lot of these synchro matchups, not having one less monster to synchro with. But the issue with playing extra Ogres is it is once per turn, and it does have to be sent to the graveyard, so it doesn't play around Herald, which base summons very early on, and then again it interacts with Called By the Grave and Triple Tactics talents. So it's got its own issues, but I feel like you definitely want to be playing 2 of it. Bell, I think, is extremely underrated right now because I don't see a lot of decks playing it. Some people are, but it's not super common. But Bell negates a lot of things right now. It negates Water Enchantress, it negates Dark, which is very big in this matchup because if you let your opponent resolve a Dark, they can summon back your Omen and then like maybe banish the Omen you have on field or banish something else that you have. It's a huge thing that almost every deck can just summon back your Omen against you and then banish a card on your side of the field. That's actually kind of nuts. And so Bell's good against that. It's good against DPE, good against like 90% of the dragon cards, great against Drytron, which is another Scythe deck, good against PK, the main Scythe deck. I think that Boast Bell is just really underrated right now, and I've really been enjoying 2 copies in this deck. I think it has a lot of applications right now, and then really same with the DD Crow. And so we effectively have 3 cards that deal with graveyard effects, so that's key. I know a lot of you guys might be also wondering why only 1 Ash Blossom. Well, I feel that Ash is a little bit weak in this current format. It's probably the easiest thing to play through or play around, and so I felt that I wanted the highest impact. I want that Nib to resolve, and I want that combo with Nib plus like Imperm or Nib Veiler, Nib Ogre against the Griffin. I want those type of combos, or I want something stopping a DPE or stopping a Right, or I guess Ash can stop, or not Right, but Enchantress. Ash can stop Water Enchantress too, but so can Bell, but Ash doesn't stop DPE. I wanted the most high impact cards, and I felt that these were the best 14 hand traps that I could play. I was also considering these Cyframe cards like Gamma, but I didn't want to add another brick into the deck because again, I wanted to be as consistent as possible. So the key is again, consistency, and then having a high number of hand traps, being able to play through hand traps. These were all extremely important. And now the other way that we play through hand traps with this deck is by including some other extenders of our own, which is why we play 3 copies of Crossout Designator, 1 copy of Called By the Grave, 2 copies of Fusion Destiny, and then of course these aren't extenders, but they go along with the Fusion Destiny, the Celestial and the Dasher. And so these 6 cards, not these 2, will help you play through hand traps. And again, very key this format. And so if you combine this with the extenders mentioned before, the 2 copies of Revolt, the 1-for-1, and then the 3 copies of Karis, this gives us a total of 12 extenders. And of course, it's a little questionable whether or not to consider Revolt an extender, but it is indeed a reactive extender. It puts more monsters on your board, it searches you more cards to your hand, it reinforces your engine. It's definitely an extender, but also defense, and so it plays multiple roles, but I do think it's fair to include in this category. And I'm going to show you exactly why. The same with Fusion Destiny. It's very easy to think like, how are these extenders? These are just standalone good cards, but they do actually help you extend your plays. Alright, and so really quick, I'm just going to show you guys a quick combo with Fractal, Rescue Cat, and Revolt, showing how Revolt can be an extender in this hand, and how you can also play around hand traps with this hand, because again, it's very important in this format that we play around them. I've mentioned it a billion times in this video, it's definitely key. And so the way you would play this hand out, and it doesn't matter what your other 2 cards are, they could be literally anything, but the way you play this hand out is you first want to start to test for hand traps before making your main plays that would lose to them. And so for example, Rescue Cat would lose to an Ash Blossom, it would lose to Imperm, Veiler, or really any type of disruption. And so we do not want to start with the Rescue Cat because again, it would lose to it. Instead, we test for other hand traps, and so you would start by activating your Fractal effect to again test for an Ash Blossom. See if your opponent has that Ash. And so activate Fractal's effect, and we're going to use Fractal to send a Kit to the graveyard, and then Kit's effect will send Nerval to the graveyard, and then Nerval's effect will search for a Karis. If our opponent did have Ash Blossom, they probably would have used it by now, because the typical play at this point would just be to summon whatever we just search, and then use the effect, banish to summon Blossom, and then extend from there. And so usually the only point in which you can Ash is right then, and so if they have it, they use it. Now, we know they don't have Ash at this point, so we need to test for effect negation. And again, we don't want to try testing that with our Rescue Cat, because if they have it, we lose. And that would be really unfortunate. Now, the cool thing about Revolt here is you can special summon monsters from your banished or your graveyard. And so, regardless of what happens, our Revolt's going to be live because we do have enough monsters in the graveyard to get to an Omen. At this point, we've got 3, and then both of these will somehow end up in the grave. So we're gonna have 4. But I think the safer play in this situation is to discard the Rescue Cat to summon the Karis, and then try to use Karis' effect on field for 4. And so the reason you want to make this play is because going for 4 would allow you to extend further. You can't go for 2 here because we're assuming you don't have any other Beast Warrior Winged Beast in your hand. So you can't go for 2, you have to go for 4, and this also will test for that Imprimer Veiler. Whereas if instead you just normal summon the Rescue Cat and they had Imprimer Veiler, you're left with just the cat on board. I mean, you could still link it off into an Almiraj to get it into the graveyard, but you effectively are ending on an empty board. Whereas with this play, if your opponent does have the negation, you could always like normal summon a Veiler or some other hand trap, go into Anaconda, make DPE, so you still gotta play, you saved your normal summon. Whereas with the Rescue Cat play, you are using your normal summon and still losing to that interaction. But assuming they don't have the Impermanent Veiler or the effect negation on the Karis effect, what you would do is summon out a copy of Omen, and then from here, link away the Omen and the Karis into a copy of Blossom. You get the Omen effect to search. You can just search any Tri-Brigade monster, it doesn't matter what it is. Let's just say a Nerval for the sake of example. Use the Blossom's effect to special summon the Nerval. And now this would be your 4th summon. And so we know the opponent doesn't have Ash. We know they don't have effect negation. At this point, the only thing to worry about is Nibiru. And this is really where the Revolt kind of comes in handy. It's because normally if you didn't have the Revolt, you would be forced into having to summon, like using the Nerval's effect or whatever Tri-Brigade to summon out your Bear. And then Bear would be that summon, and then potentially you get Nib before getting into your DPE Revolt. But instead, what we could do in this case, because we already have the Revolt, instead of making this play, what you would traditionally do, if we go back a step, we can also actually just make our DPE with the Karis and the Omen. Like that works as well. And so what you could do is just link these away into your Anaconda. Let's see, where's Anaconda? So this is now your 3rd summon. Trigger your Omen, you can search a follow-up or you can search a DD Crow for defense. And then use Anaconda effect, summon DPE, set your Revolt. Now you're ending on DPE Revolt, potentially also with a DD Crow in hand or follow-up. And you have a loaded graveyard for your Revolt, so you're getting a follow-up anyways, really. And you're doing it all under 5 summons because it was Karis, Omen, Anaconda, DPE. That was it. So you're playing under Nib, you played around Ash, you played around like Impermanent Veiler to the best of your abilities. Like this is how Revolt would be useful. And Fusion Destiny is very similar in the way that typically with these cards, with summoning out DPE and with using Revolt, you're kind of forced into making awkward plays. Like you're forced into going into Bear to get to the Revolt, but Bear locks you out of special summoning non-Tri-Brigade monsters. And then if you wanted to get to DPE, Anaconda stops you from special summoning. And so it kind of forces you to make awkward plays, but when you draw one, you don't have to make that one awkward play anymore, and it frees up your flexibility to make other plays instead. It also means if you did get hand trapped, you're still ending on disruption as long as you play into your outs. And so especially with Revolt, playing into getting multiple monsters into the graveyard. So using Fractal to dump Kit and then Nerval, and then using Karis to summon itself out by discarding the cat. That gets 4 in grave, which sets up that Revolt, instead of just like going Fractal dump Nerval search, where you would have only ended up with 3 in graveyard, which is not enough to summon Omen. So as long as you play into it, Revolt can be an extender. But hopefully that makes sense. If you guys have any questions, just leave a comment. I can probably explain this a lot better there than I can here. Now, if we go back to this game state, if instead of having the Revolt, we had a Fusion Destiny, Fusion Destiny also helps you extend your plays. And so the typical play in this scenario would be to, again, link away the Omen and the Kaeris for a Blossom. You use Omen to search some Tri Brigade monster, special summon it with Blossom, and then you would use the Tri Brigade monster's effect to go into Bear, and then you would link the Blossom and the monster into an Anaconda. Anaconda summon DPE, DPE pop the Bear. That's how you get to a Revolt. That's the way the standard play goes. But if, let's say, you drew Fusion Destiny, that would mean you actually don't need to go Anaconda anymore. And every time you summon Anaconda in this deck, it is almost always with a Link 2 and then a non-link monster, or it might be 2 Link 2s. But regardless, you're always linking down. Like, you're always going 3 or 4 link materials, summoning the Link 2 Anaconda. And so you're losing value in that regard. However, but when you draw that Fusion Destiny, it lets you allocate those resources elsewhere into generating more defense instead. And so instead of having to make that play with this board, what you could also do instead is, rather than summoning out that Bear here, and again, at this point we're assuming they don't have Nib. If they did have Nib, we can just use Fusion Destiny afterwards. But what we could do instead of summoning Bear here is we could summon double Dragon Lords, and then we can hard summon the Bear, activate our Fusion Destiny to get to DPE, and then we'd be ending on, well, we'd pop the Bear with our DPE, but we'd be ending on Revolt, DPE, and double Dragon Lords, which is better than what we could do with the standard combo alone. And so again, it not only helps us play through hand traps, but it also adds to what we're doing. Alright, and so once again, I built this deck by the numbers. The statistics were very important, and some of the key metrics that I was looking at, one of the big ones was consistency. And again, I wanted to be able to draw my engine in at least 95% of my hands, at least 1 engine card. That was one of my key metrics. And so for that, we've got the 3 rescue cats. Just gonna break down the deck one more time and mention the stats, but we've got the cats, the Frax, the other starters, we've got the kits, the nerves, Kaeris, and 1-for-1. So we've got 18 engine cards. This gives us a 95% chance to see 1, a 72.5% to see 2. Drawing multiples, as you saw in that example combo, helps. If you open with Cat plus Fractal, you can play through hand traps a lot easier. You can kind of lean into some hand traps and then play around other ones. You think your opponent might have Nib? Well, you can make your plays on 4 summons. You can do things a little bit differently when you do have multiples, but I do want to at least see 1 so that I can play. So that was one key statistic. The next was that I wanted to see more than 1 hand trap in over 50% of my games. And so for the hand traps, you've got 3 copies of Nib, 3 Imperms, 2 Veilers, Ogres, Bells, Crow, and Ash Blossom. So we've got 14 hand traps. This actually gives us a 54.7% chance of seeing more than 1 and an 88.4% chance of seeing 2. And then the third and final key metric for me was that I was going to be able to see an extender in 75% of hands, and this was just to match the odds of my opponent having a hand trap. So the opponent has a hand trap, I want to have the extender. And for those, we've got the 3 crossouts, Called By, 2 Fusion Destinies, and then the 2 copies of Revolt. These are 40 cards, and then we also have the Celestial and the Dasher for 42. And then, just to contextualize those extenders, by playing 8 of them, 12 if you consider the Kaeris and the 1-for-1s, which do serve multiple roles, we have an 83% chance of drawing 1, and I actually did not calculate the odds of drawing 2. We just need to see 1, pretty high chance of seeing 2. And if we look at the hand trap numbers, that we're playing 14 of those, you could just estimate that it's a little bit under 50% if we were at 54.7% chance of seeing 2 hand traps with 14 cards in the 42 card deck. So pretty similar to that. Probably a little bit under 40, I'd estimate. Under 50, I'd estimate around 48-49% chance of seeing multiple extenders. What that might look like is an average hand for this deck being like, let's say, Fractal, Kit, Nib, Ogre, Fusion Destiny, like something like that. Or maybe instead of that second hand trap, you might have a second extender like Crossout. But the key was just identifying the trends that would be important, like looking at the metagame, considering, Griffin and the early negations of Baron, Herald, and Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, recognizing that we need to be playing significant hand traps for any deck to be viable. I think if you're playing a rogue deck, you have to have some angle in the format, and this was the best way for Tri Brigades to kind of wedge in my opinion. But yeah, you gotta identify your key metrics and then build a deck based on that. I do think some changes that could be made. I think we could cut a hand trap. I think we could also cut the Called by the Grave, because if we go back to the statistics, I'll put them on the screen, but ideally we wanted a greater than 50% chance of seeing multiple hand traps. We've got nearly a 55% chance. And then we also wanted a 75% chance of seeing an extender. We've got an 83% chance. So we've got a little bit of extra leeway there. But on the other hand, I think we could improve some of the deck's consistency. We could also, just by reducing the number of cards in the deck, increase the odds of drawing some of our key pieces. And so if, let's say for the sake of example, we were to cut Called by the Grave and a Ghost Bell, so now we'd be playing 13 hand traps in a 40 card deck. We would have still a 53% chance of seeing more than one and 87% chance of seeing one hand trap. We'd be playing now 11 extenders, giving us a 81.9% chance of seeing one. And now the big difference is we still have those same 18 engine cards, but we have less cards in deck. And so we go from a 90% chance of seeing one to a 96% chance of seeing one. I'm sorry, 95 to 96%. And now what I think is the biggest difference is we go from a 72.5% chance of seeing at least 2 engine cards to a 76% chance of seeing at least 2 engine cards. And so not only have we hit all of the key metrics from before, but we also now are hitting 75% chance of seeing multiple engine cards, which again, as I showed you, helps you play through hand traps even better. And so with these changes, you sacrifice the odds of seeing your hand traps a little bit more, you sacrifice the odds to see an extender a little bit more, but you do have a stronger engine. So these are just some of the sacrifices that you sometimes have to choose between when you're building a deck by the numbers like this. But the key is that you have to make sure, or you have to question whether or not your engine is good enough. Like, is your engine worth increasing the odds of drawing, increasing the consistency of, if you have to sacrifice like hand traps or extenders or maybe bomb cards or whichever other roles of cards are relevant in your deck, in your current metagame, in your local metagame. So those are just things to think about though. I think for Tri Brigade in particular, we can lose an extender because adding more engine cards helps you extend anyways, but that simply isn't the case for all decks. But that's it for the main deck. It is 40 or 42 cards depending on how you want to build the deck. I think you really go either way. The extra deck's pretty standard. I don't think there were any changes from the last list. We've just got 3 copies of Omen, 1 Rugal, 2 copies of Blossom. I like 2 copies of this over 2 copies of Bear because this will help you extend at any point in the game, whereas Bear is often best early on. You're typically not summoning it in the mid game because you will have access to your engine anyways, and if you're playing, you're putting up game on board, not usually setting up too far in advance. So I feel like 2 Blossom is good. The 1 copy of Bear, of course, if you want to play 2, you definitely can. It does come up, but it just depends on how you want to play the deck. I'm fine with 2 Blossoms, 1 Bear. After that, we've got the 1 copy of Almirage, the 1 copy of Linkuriboh, which is only in for the 1-for-1 pretty much, because you 1-for-1, and you still want to get that Nerval in the graveyard when you do summon it. You go for the Linkuriboh, get it into the graveyard, get the effect to search, continue playing from there. 1 copy of Double Dragon Lords, 1 Doom Eagle, Appaloosa. Appaloosa, I do think, is actually more relevant now in this deck than it has been in a very long time, because there are certain matchups in certain situations where you actually might prefer Appaloosa Revolt over DPE Revolt, and so you have to consider whether or not you want more interactions with your opponent that don't really get rid of the cards but rather negate them, versus DPE, which is clearing a single card off of the board and then giving you more cards to follow up with. So DPE is a lot stronger from a card advantage standpoint, whereas Appaloosa is a lot better from a tempo standpoint. And so theoretically, you really have to make that choice between denying your opponent the beatdown versus actively choosing to play the control. And by going for DPE, a lot of times you're actively choosing to play the control because the control often will play for card advantage, whereas the beatdown will be going for damage, going for speed, going for making a bigger board, and Appaloosa is a little bit better at preventing them from doing so. And so how you plan on winning the game will dictate what play you go for, and the key will be just reading your opponent, reading well, really the further you get along in an event, you'll start to get an idea of what you're playing at top tables, scouting, and that's going to help you make the correct play in this situation. Like if you're playing against Phantom Knights or Drytron, your DPE is not going to do too much, but Apollousa will give you a lot more interactions against those types of decks. And now if you guys want to hear more about who's to beat down, or if this just sounds like jargon to you, check out my whole video on the theory of who's to beat down and determining your role within a game. Again, it can change throughout the game, throughout an event, and it's not just something that you decide at the beginning while you're building your deck. Of course, you have what happens in the ideal scenarios, but it isn't always the case, and you have to be privy to this information just so you can make informed decisions. So definitely check that video out if you have a chance. A link to it will be in the top right corner of the screen in the YouTube cards somewhere up here, but check that out when you get a chance. To finish off the extra deck, we have one copy of Access Code Talker and then one copy of Anaconda, and with that our DPE. And then finally for the side deck, we've got 3 copies of Dimensional Barrier, 3 copies of Lancia, 3 copies of Droll, 3 copies of Cosmic Cyclone, and then 3 copies of Forbidden Droplets. And I think in the previous list I was playing Droplets in the main deck, and I think in some ways you can, but I felt like right now in this current format you need to be able to stop your opponent, and I felt that the hand traps are going to be a little bit more impactful here, because having a single hand trap that your opponent plays through and then also having the Droplets is a lot worse than just simply stopping your opponent's plays. So right now, given the power level of these decks, you definitely need to be stopping them, especially considering the Adventure Tenyi matchups, the PK matchups, and then also the Virtual World matchups, where a lot of these combo decks now are making different disruptions within different dimensions of the game. What I mean by that is their negates, their interactions are not all just on the field in their monster zone, but they're going to be having things in the hand. They're going to have their own hand traps in their hand. They're going to have, of course, their stuff on the field, but they're going to have snow in the graveyard. They're going to have blackout set or Chuchi set. They're going to have spells and traps that you need to deal with, hand traps, as well as things in the grave on top of interactions on the board. And so Droplets itself, again, is not enough to break those boards. In some matchups it is, but not reliably enough, I think, to be in the main deck, whereas the hand traps are reliable enough to stop your opponent if you draw multiples. And so that is why Droplets has been relegated to the side deck now. Cyclone I think is necessary. You might face a Mind deck, you might face Eldritch or some random trap deck, you need this for it. Barrier is good against all of the numerous synchro decks right now. There's more than I can even count. Lancia and Droll are just generally good in various matchups, and so if in a certain matchup where it'd be more impactful, you would like take out the less impactful hand traps that you have, like maybe the Veilers come out for Drolls or something like that, depending on the matchup, or the Imperms might come out, the Bells could come out, or maybe you take out like the Crossout Designators. Maybe you're going against a deck that doesn't play hand traps, again like Phantom Knights, Drytron, or something like that we're not really expecting to see too many things that those cards would be effective against. So you can put in more hand traps, take out your dead cards, and be more effective in those matchups. But all in all, it is a pretty standard sideboard. I think a lot of times what gets lost with a lot of players is ultimately that despite the cards in your deck and in your side deck, you actually just have to play well. Like you guys saw in the combo earlier, you got to play around hand traps, you got to play around disruptions, you have to make the right play. And especially if you're playing a rogue deck, and if you want to win more games with Tri-Brigade, you have to learn how to play around disruptions. And so check out the Tri-Brigade combo guide that focuses on how to do just that, playing through and around disruptions like hand traps, DPE, negates, and more. The video will be right here on your screen right now. Click it, watch it, and let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good one, guys.